The moment a leader crosses a line is rarely obvious at first. It usually begins with a subtle shift, a comment that feels off, a sharper tone, a reaction that doesn't quite match the situation. Then it accelerates. That is exactly what unfolded this week with Donald Trump. In a political environment where the public has grown accustomed to his anger, insults and threats, this moment stood apart. What we're seeing now is not simply loud behavior. It is behavior that raises concern. It no longer feels purely political. It feels personal. And for the first time in a very real way, it is colliding with legal boundaries that could reshape everything. This is not about a single angry post or one tense appearance. This is about power, ego, and the legal system converging at the same moment. And the impact is not limited to Trump himself. The strain is spreading outward, placing pressure on institutions that rely on restraint, norms, and accountability to function. The question then is what triggered this escalation? It wasn't random. It wasn't driven by headlines or partisan attacks. It came from inside his own political circle, from people who had long stood by him, defended him, and benefited from loyalty to him. When those individuals raised questions, the response revealed something critical. He did not react as a president confronting oversight. He reacted as someone who felt trapped. And history shows that the most volatile moments arise when powerful figures sense that control is slipping. When courts, laws, and even allies no longer feel reliably aligned. That is the point we appear to have reached. This is why the moment matters. It is not simply about political tension. It is about whether systems designed to enforce accountability can hold when ego pushes back against legal reality. The pressure began with what should have been an ordinary event, a budget hearing. A congressional committee carrying out its basic responsibility, asking about funding priorities, fiscal consequences, and the coming year's plans. In most administrations, this would barely register, but to Trump, it did not feel procedural. It felt personal. He watched members of his own party ask questions that would normally be considered routine oversight, and he interpreted those questions as attacks. That reaction should have raised alarms. A stable leader tolerates scrutiny. A stable leader answers questions with evidence and explanation. A stable leader understands that oversight is not betrayal. Trump responded differently. Feeling threatened, he shifted immediately into confrontation. The response was loud, public, and aggressive. Social media posts followed quickly, accusing individuals by name, framing allies as adversaries. That is the moment when the situation stopped being predictable, because when rhetoric intensifies, behavior becomes harder to anticipate, and when that rhetoric comes from someone with an enormous and deeply committed following, it carries weight far beyond ordinary political speech. Words stop being commentary and begin functioning as signals. This raises a larger concern. If this is the reaction to normal oversight, what happens when pressure increases further? What happens as investigations advance, court decisions are issued, and legal consequences move closer? If a budget hearing produces this level of response, the next stages of legal accountability could provoke something far more destabilizing. This is not about a bad day or an isolated lapse in judgment. It reflects a pattern: escalating anger, escalating threats, and escalating instability. Unfolding at the same time, the legal system is narrowing its focus. The budget hearing may have been the spark, but it exposed the underlying issue. A leader who struggles with accountability, who treats oversight as betrayal, and whose personal identity is now colliding with the rule of law in increasingly dangerous ways. And the situation intensified further when the response moved beyond insults. The language shifted from criticism to intimidation. That is the dividing line between political conflict and institutional crisis. When leaders move from argument to coercion, the system itself begins to strain. Following the hearing, Trump launched a sustained series of posts, not a few angry remarks, but a steady stream, targeting members of his own party, accusing them of betrayal, and suggesting they deserved consequences. This was not simply harsh rhetoric. It marked a tonal shift. The risk is not only in the language itself, but in how it is received. When someone commands a massive audience, including supporters who have previously demonstrated a willingness to act, their words can be interpreted as direction rather than opinion. When political opponents are framed as traitors, when vague suggestions imply that consequences should follow, the message creates targets. That danger intensified when Trump went further, publicly sharing office phone numbers of lawmakers and urging supporters to contact them. This crossed into direct facilitation of harassment. The consequences were immediate. Staff officers received threatening calls. Lawmakers reported messages calling for harm and punishment. Security measures were increased. Capitol Police were forced to intervene. Individuals were placed at risk, not because of their actions, but because of the amplification of inflammatory rhetoric. That is the turning point. This is no longer a debate about expression or politics. It becomes a matter of public safety. It becomes a question of responsibility, and it forces a deeper examination of whether a leader is willing or able to restrain the use of power when legal accountability begins to close in. And that escalation is now veering into something far more serious, the encouragement of hostility toward political opponents. What makes this especially dangerous is that it is unfolding inside the same party that has spent years shielding Donald Trump from consequences. This is no longer simply alarming behavior. It is dangerous behavior. It forces a critical question into the open. What comes next? Because if a leader is willing to go this far when challenged, what will happen when he feels truly cornered? That is the moment when the story stops being about political conflict and starts becoming about institutional survival. That is why attention has intensified, and why the stakes are higher than at any point before. This is the point where the narrative changes. It is no longer just that Trump appears out of control. It is that he is becoming a threat to the stability of his own party. Republicans have stood by him through scandal after scandal. They have minimized controversies, justified extreme conduct, and built entire political identities around loyalty to him. But when the consequences begin landing on their own members, when threats move from abstract rhetoric to real danger, even the most committed allies begin to pause. That hesitation matters, because loyalty has always been the foundation of Trump's political strength. If loyalty fractures, the movement weakens, and that fracture has already begun. Within hours, some of Trump's most influential allies broke their silence publicly, not behind closed doors, not through anonymous sources, but openly and on the record. They described his behavior as unacceptable. They warned that it was dangerous. They said it posed a threat to national stability. That represents a significant shift. It demonstrates that the pressure is no longer coming solely from political opponents or the media. It is coming from inside his own party. And when a party begins to view its leader as a liability rather than an asset, the political calculus changes dramatically. What stood out most was the tone of the criticism. This was not cautious disagreement or polite distancing. It was a warning, a clear message that the behavior had crossed a line and could no longer be defended. That kind of statement has the power to alter the course of an election, because once prominent figures speak out, others begin to reassess their own silence. The fear that kept many lawmakers quiet begins to fade, and momentum shifts. But this is not only about political positioning, it is about safety. Lawmakers are not simply worried about polling numbers or future endorsements. They are worried about their families, their staff, and the people they represent. They understand that a single post from a powerful figure can result in harassment, threats, or worse. That reality gives their reaction added weight. This is not just a political break. It is a moral one. It is a moment when a party is forced to confront what it stands for. The choice is stark. Is loyalty absolute, regardless of consequences? Or does the rule of law still matter? Is the priority protecting a leader whose words lead to intimidation, or protecting the democratic system that allows the country to function? When lawmakers begin calling for restraint, accountability, or even resignation, it signals that the party has reached a crossroads. And in politics, moments of choice define futures. A party that cannot rein in its leader loses credibility. A party that cannot protect its own members loses legitimacy. And a party that places personal loyalty above constitutional principles risks losing its future altogether. That is why the internal reaction matters so much. It shows that the conflict is no longer just between Trump and legal institutions. It is between Trump and the broader framework that holds the country together. And when that line is crossed, the consequences are not merely political. They are historic. This is also where the situation becomes especially dangerous for Trump himself. What is happening now is no longer confined to political theater or public outbursts. It is beginning to take on legal significance. When power, ego, and the law collide, the law does not respond to emotion or loyalty. It responds to evidence. And with every post, every threat, every escalation, Trump is generating more of it. When a leader uses language suggesting that opponents are traitors or that they should be dealt with, legal experts immediately begin asking hard questions. Does this constitute incitement? Is it intimidation? Is it an attempt to pressure elected officials through fear? Those questions carry serious consequences. Once statements are examined as potential evidence, the battle shifts. It is no longer about messaging or public opinion. It becomes a confrontation with the justice system, which operates on proof rather than allegiance. The legal debates will be complex. There will be arguments about free speech, intent, and context, but the underlying reality is straightforward. Trump is testing the outer limits of acceptable conduct for a national leader, doing so publicly, with a massive audience and with identifiable targets. That is not normal behavior. It is not the language of someone confident in their position. It is the language of someone under pressure, acting defensively, trying to hold on to control. And once the legal system focuses its attention, desperation becomes a liability. There is another critical dimension to this. The legal risk is not confined to what Trump said. It also extends to what followed. His supporters have a documented history of acting on his words. When he labels someone a traitor, reactions escalate. When he frames individuals as threats, responses intensify. When he suggests action, many interpret it as permission. That chain reaction is what transforms political speech into potential criminal conduct. Investigators and courts do not evaluate words in isolation. They examine impact. They look at the threats, the calls, the security responses, and the real-world intimidation that followed. They assess cause and effect. And when all of that is considered together, it paints a deeply troubling picture, not just of a leader pushing boundaries, but of one attempting to undermine the very constraints designed to limit power. That is why the legal dimension of this story is so critical. This is not simply about Trump's conduct. It is about whether the justice system can withstand pressure from a figure who refuses to accept limits. And if the law fails to hold, the consequences for the country will extend far beyond any single political battle, reshaping the presidency itself in ways that cannot easily be undone. A future where political leaders can intimidate lawmakers without consequence is not a future any democracy can afford. And that is exactly why this situation is accelerating so quickly and why Donald Trump is losing control of the narrative. The reality is that Trump is no longer just battling the courts. He is fighting against the very thing that once fueled his power, chaos. For years, chaos worked in his favor. It kept opponents distracted, blurred facts, buried details, and pushed emotions ahead of reason. Trump thrived in that environment because confusion protected him. But now chaos has turned against him. It is no longer a shield. It is evidence. Every outburst, every threat, every public meltdown, every post that reads like a warning to the government adds to a growing record. Instead of projecting strength, it reveals instability. It shows a leader who is cornered and struggling to maintain control. And history tells us that when powerful figures feel trapped, they respond in predictable ways. They escalate, they intimidate, they lash out in an attempt to project authority they no longer fully possess. But with each escalation, Trump reinforces the very argument his critics have been making for months, that he is reckless, unstable, and unfit to lead. This is where the most important shift occurs. Trump's supporters are not just listening to what he says anymore. They are watching how he behaves. And when behavior becomes erratic, even loyal followers begin to question what they are witnessing. Loyalty has limits. People do not want to be associated with a movement that appears to be spiraling, or with a leader openly attacking courts, institutions, and the foundations of governance. Even if Trump retains a committed base, the risk now is fragmentation, and those cracks are already forming. Once support begins to fracture, control over the story disappears. Trump can no longer fully shape the message. He can no longer dictate the outcome, and that loss of narrative control is more damaging than any single court ruling. This moment is no longer just political turbulence. It is the unraveling of a movement. When followers sense that a leader is losing control, momentum collapses, and that is when pressure intensifies from every direction. Courts move faster, media scrutiny sharpens, opponents gain confidence, weakness becomes visible, panic becomes detectable, and when desperation collides with power, stability disappears. That is why this moment matters so deeply. The consequences will not remain confined to courtrooms or political debates. They will spill into institutions, into governance, and into the future direction of the country. As this enters its final phase, events will not slow down. They will accelerate, and acceleration in politics often leads to disorder. The legal system will move with increased urgency. Once a judge signals a willingness to act decisively, timelines compress, motions stack up, and Trump's legal team is forced into reaction rather than strategy. The tone shifts from consideration to action, and that changes everything. At the same time, the public begins to recognize a pattern. When the same themes emerge across court filings, hearings, and reporting, the narrative stops feeling partisan. It starts to feel factual. The conversation shifts from opinion to evidence. That shift is where support erodes, and as the pressure intensifies, the Republican Party faces an unavoidable decision: stand by Trump, regardless of the consequences, or protect the party's long-term future. That debate is already happening privately. When that split becomes public, the impact will extend far beyond Washington. As risk becomes personal, allies begin to step away. Movements rarely collapse through dramatic betrayals. They dissolve through quiet exits, calculated distance, and practical self-preservation. That is how political power fades. If Trump remains in office during this pressure, internal chaos will grow. Staff, advisors, and allies will choose sides. Leaks will multiply. Internal conflict will become visible in real time. Every fracture will be observed and amplified. Ultimately, Trump's next move will define everything. Whether he escalates further, attempts negotiation, or pursues a power play, the decision will not simply be political. It will be historical. This is no longer just another controversy or legal battle. It is a direct test of the American system itself. The central question is no longer whether Trump prevails. It is whether the system holds. If the system fails, the damage will not be temporary. It will be lasting. And that is why this moment has drawn so much attention. What is unfolding now goes far beyond one individual. It is a stress test of democratic assumptions that have existed for decades. The belief that no one is above the law, that courts function independently, that oversight is protected. Trump is actively challenging those assumptions, testing whether intimidation works, whether pressure silences accountability, and whether chaos can overpower legal constraints. If threats become effective, the precedent will endure. Future leaders will learn from it. The rules will change permanently. That is why alarm is spreading across Washington, even among those who rarely agree on anything. This is also why public reaction matters. They erode gradually, incident by incident, justification by justification, until safeguards disappear. This moment forces a choice. Either the rules apply to everyone, or power defines reality. Either oversight is defended, or intimidation becomes normalized. These moments are rare, but when they arrive, they shape history. Decisions made now by judges, lawmakers, and voters will define how power operates for generations. This is not just a headline. It is a warning. A warning about what happens when ego overtakes law, when loyalty replaces accountability, and when fear becomes a political weapon. The story is still unfolding. The consequences are still forming. But one conclusion is already unavoidable. After this moment, American politics will not look the same. The only remaining question is whether the system emerges stronger, or whether this becomes the point where it began to fail. And that is why everyone should be paying attention.